So to my right, there is Duan Tran. Prior to teaching, Duan was an administrator for various social service agencies in 4 states for over 20 years. Most recently, Duan was the program director of Community Service Program, overseeing the Victim Advocate Program. Prior to this, he was a program supervisor at the Mental Health Association of Orange County, working with the homeless population. Duan also worked at various residential substance abuse programs, including being a supervisor at Cirque Lodge in Sundance, Utah. Duan also has 5 years of experience working in child welfare and is also trained in EMDR. Duan Tran received his MSW from Loyola University, Chicago, Illinois. That's cool. In 2002, Duan is currently the CalSWAC Child Welfare and Mental Health Project Coordinator. He also teaches courses in social work, field instruction, and practice classes, and also serves as the academic and graduate advisor. And then to his right, we have Dr. Michelle Martin, who has worked in the social work field for over 3 decades in a range of practice settings. Dr. Martin has a PhD in Peace Studies, a master's in social science with an emphasis in global policy studies, and a master of social work. Dr. Martin teaches social welfare policy courses in the Department of Social Work at Cal State University, Fullerton. She is the author of 3 books in social work and human services: Introduction to Human Services Through the Eyes of Practice Settings, Advocacy for Social Justice, Local and Global Implications, and Introduction to Social Work Through the Eyes of Practice Settings. That repeated. Dr. Martin researched, so she authored 3 books. Dr. Martin research and teaching interests focus on social welfare policy and global policy practice. She researches in the areas of global conflict, refugees, including protracted refugee situations, and global human rights. Dr. Martin is a qualitative researcher and conducted primarily internet research focusing on ways social media is used by immigrants and refugees as a forum for identity expression and political engagement. Dr. Martin is passionate about social workers engaging in advocacy for social justice with highly marginalized and vulnerable populations such as immigrants, refugees, and indigenous populations. And she's dedicated to teaching and mentoring social work students so that they can develop their own passion in this field. So let's give them a hand initially. And then what we're going to do is check in so we all know everyone's names, and our lecturers and speakers can know their audience, know our wonderful students in the program. So say your name, and the check-in question will be, I have it. How has your environment shaped your personality and identities? So how has your environment shaped your personality and identities? So I can start. My name is Anna, program coordinator, and my environment has shaped, I'd say, my personality and identities. I think it's informed it a lot because just culture and interests, I get a lot from my family and my friends. So to be more specific about that, I have a really good support system, first of all, and then second of all, just any of my activities and hobbies and passion for social justice as well really roots from my surroundings, really comes from and is rooted from my surroundings. So that's my answer. Vicky? It's a tough question. You can think about it. Okay. What was the question again? Yeah.
So how has your environment? Anna, that's a deep question. Good morning on a Friday.
Okay, we could change it. What are you going to do for spring break? We're changing it just this one time. I'll give you leeway because it's spring break.
Okay. Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm a 3rd year here. I'm a human services major. Something I'm doing for spring break. I'm going to catch up on sleep. And that's probably it for right now.
Okay. I'm Vanessa, and I'm a senior. I'll be graduating in the spring, and right now for spring break I'm going to do a 2-week long training for an ABA position.
Are you planning? Sorry, really quick. So, what's your degree in?
Child and adolescent studies.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandra. I'm a fourth year, and my major is communicative disorders. What I'll do for spring break is catch up on studying and working on future projects beforehand.
Hi everyone, my name is C. I'm the undergrad assistant for this program. I'm also a fourth year health science major, and my career of interest is master's in the public health and then PA as well.
My name is Emily. I am the graduate assistant for this program. I'm currently in first year master's public health student. My career interest is to continue on and do a PhD, and I will be studying and working on a project for this spring break, unfortunately.
So we're gonna get into deep questions. We'll save it for check-in session. Please go to the check-in session and yeah, make sure you're completing your hours because they are gonna be due May 31st. Then we'll go ahead and give the floor to our speakers.
So I just want to start off by asking you guys, what's your understanding of what social workers do and who are they and what is social work? Just out of curiosity, because I know you're in human services.
Both
and
of my aunts are
adolescents.
actually social workers, so I've been exposed to this all my life.
Okay.
So one of my aunts is an LCSW. She's a mental health therapist on Skid Row right now, and I think her job is really cool.
Okay.
And my other aunt works more with the foster youth.
Okay.
So their roles are really different.
Yeah.
So there's so many roles and like so many settings you can be in, and I've seen it like growing up with them while they were bachelors and then while they went to their masters. Like everything has changed. How many positions they've had and like what they've grown in their positions. So I know there's not just one setting you can be in.
Okay. Good answer. Very good answer. Anyone else wants to take a gander?
I feel like it's social work is a lot of like crisis kind of issues or like more immediate response kind of ways.
Okay.
Because like I look at child development maybe with a different lens because I in developmental major and I also want to do OT, so I'm focusing on like holistic ways, more like just to improve their abilities and like I know that social work is a completely different realm of just to help these individuals like in times of need.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? I think those are really good, solid answers. Anyone else wants to share a little bit what they think social workers do and who are we as social workers? Okay. And we'll go into a little more detail about it, but just in general, social workers, one of the cool things about why I came into this field is because there's so many opportunities, from the micro level to the macro level, and like I say, you can do direct practice. So anywhere from working with kids and adults and homeless people, any type of population you can think about, we are there and what we do. But then we also do on a macro level as well too. So we have mayors who are LCSW or masters in social work. We have, governors and I don't know if one of our county supervisors is an MSW. And so we look at it from all perspectives. So it's not like just direct hands-on practice. And then also from an administrative perspective, a lot of these agencies are ran off of policies and procedures. And so having an MSW really gives you a really great perspective as to the bigger lens or the bigger landscape of what's going on. And so that's just this really quick, brief intro. And even I had mentioned this to some of my students before, I've been in the field for over 20 years. And just even like 6 months ago, I learned about new jobs that are required in MSW that I had never thought even existed before. For instance, the FBI, they currently hire specifically for MSW to be victim advocates, within their units. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. So again, this is it crosses a lot of the boards. We actually have MSW graduate who works at Disneyland in their HR unit. And one would say, why would someone be working at Disneyland with their MSW degree? Just out of curiosity, what would you think? Why would that be helpful for the HR department to have an MSW? Okay.
I'm not really sure.
So what does HR do?
It's like the human resources where it just handles like customers or like even the employee like issues of human relations.
Human relations, they're in charge of hiring everybody. So MSW is, one of the things that we train for is to assess people. And so what better to have someone who's on the interviewing panel assessing potential applicants for employees, to kind of look through from a different lens to kind of see whether or not they're a good fit for, Disneyland or whoever. So again, it does not have to be all clinical by any means, but that's usually what most people go to.
I think that if you put our careers side by side, there would probably be points where we intersected and had similar types of careers, and then other times where we would be completely different. I started off in direct practice. I've worked, I think, in most practice settings, victim advocacy. I've done hospice, school social work. And at some point I decided to go into more global work. I was working with refugees, became very interested in that. A lot of global work is policy. So then I ventured into more policy work to the point to where, and then ultimately teaching. And so one of the things that I like so much about social work, which Professor Tran said as well, is just the breadth of it. It's one of the first, and I don't know if you want to go ahead and, yeah. It's one of the only helping careers that is as broad as it is. So we're trained as in what we call direct practice, meaning working with individuals, families. So we also train our students to work on a broad level, which would be macro practice, and that's community development, advocacy, policy work. And because we're trained on so many different levels, the practice side, the policy side, and then working with different levels of society, that makes us very adaptable in careers. I mean, I don't know that this is accurate, but I've actually heard some people say that the MSW is like an MBA for not-for-profits if you go into the administrative track. Because we are used to working with individuals within systems, and then systems themselves, and then communities. And community can be defined anything from your local neighborhood all the way up to what we would call the global community, and dealing with human rights issues with NGO, with working with NGOs and United Nations, et cetera. So in that way, if someone has a particular passion for working with marginalized populations, because one of the other differences between social work and other helping fields is that most social workers are working at least partly with mandated clients. So you don't necessarily have a choice in terms of the types of populations that you work with. And you have to have a real passion for a wide range of people. And then something else that sets us apart as a career is a focus on social justice. The roots of our profession go back quite far, but we definitely trace it back to Jane Addams and the Settlement House movement. And she was if you haven't heard of her, she's lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and she was very passionate about social justice and human rights of migrant populations that were coming over and being exploited in the factories. And a lot of the dynamics that she dealt with are very similar to what we deal with today, working with especially displaced populations. And so that focus on at-risk populations and the focus on social justice is very significant in our field. And again, our clients could be individuals, families, small groups, organizations, communities. We work with them all, oftentimes overlapping and in a lot of different, but we say client or client system, we aren't necessarily talking about an individual. We may be, but we may also be talking about an entire community. So when you think about social problems, because that's what we tend to be focused on is social problems. And a lot of our practice settings where social workers work are focused on social problems. So if you think about psychology, they oftentimes, you can have community psychology that's focused on social problems as well, but psychology tends to take a look more deeply at maybe psychopathology. And it's not that we don't, but our focus, the lens through which they evaluate individuals and our client systems would be through the lens of social problems, and then with a focus on optimal functioning. So here is just a list of some common social problems that we encounter. And obviously it's not an exhaustive list, right? I mean, can anyone think of any other social problems that aren't listed here that create challenges for individuals? I'm sorry?
Gender.
Yeah.
Gender, right. So gender bias would be an example of a social problem. Yeah. Sexual harassment, etc. What else?
Would disabilities be under healthcare challenge?
Could be, or you could just have disabilities be one, and then it would depend on the type of disability and then the environment that an individual is in, the extent that that becomes a social problem. Another one that I don't think I put down here that we hear more and more because of environmental issues is disaster relief. What we're seeing more and more with these mass shootings. I mean, that's becoming, gun issues is becoming a social problem, or I should say has become a pretty significant social problem in our country. So social problems shift. Personal problems aren't always social problems. So just because someone has a disability or is struggling with depression or something like that doesn't necessarily mean that they have they might be in a really supportive environment and have access to great health care. But we call it a social problem when it impacts a population and it rises to the level that even if you aren't impacted by it personally, it's going to impact you. Right? So like juvenile violence, I might not have an issue with that in my own home, but it's going to impact me if I become a victim of that.
And just out of curiosity, any local recent social issues that you are aware of for those who pay attention to the news? Because that's one of the things that we do, at least in my class in grad school, is that I try to connect students with the academic piece with what's going on here and now. So there's that connection of, oh yeah, I can see how this may relate, right? Because there's always we have folks that are just amazingly do well academics on, reading articles and journals, but for them to kind of see how, like what Dr. Martin had mentioned, it's like, how does that really impact me? Like, why do gun violence, why is that a concern for me? I live in Orange County. We haven't had any gun violence. Not true, but that's something that you want to kind of see. And so just out of curiosity, any recent news? Oh, yeah.
So the homeless being moved out of the river,
Right.
That's like, we talked about it actually in my 201 class.
Uh-huh.
So I was like, oh, wow. So me and my roommate were talking about it too. I was like, do you notice that there's not that many people anymore? Or do you notice
They
how
completely
hidden
move it. There's not, yeah.
And it's not to I think a lot of more homeless people are coming to Fullerton too, because every time we're walking home and stuff, I see more homeless people setting up camp near our home or outside of our apartment complex. And I'm like, it's real. I was like, you see it just as they started moving them. I was like, you see more people coming into the city than even in San Juan.
Right. And just if you think about that one issue, homelessness, one of the things that the issues that we deal with as social workers is they're complex. And it creates challenges for us sometimes in terms of advocacy because the, let's say, mainstream population that isn't a social worker, oftentimes they don't want to see the complexity of social problems. And so they might, they have a simple narrative of people have to help themselves. So I'm not going to help people who don't help themselves or something, or people just need to work harder. Those are simplistic narratives. And then we're put in this position where we have to respond with a complex narrative. And if you think about homelessness, that's a great example of complexity. What are all the other social problems that intersect with homelessness?
They can't get housing because they're homeless and there's not a lot of resources for people.
Right. So poverty, right? Poverty would be one. What other issues do members of the homeless population, or at least many of them, what other challenges do they have oftentimes? What are their struggles? Yes.
Maybe substance abuse disorder.
Absolutely.
Or even just any other.
Right. They may have child welfare challenges, mental illness, substance abuse, poverty. When you start looking at the intersection between all of those social problems, you realize why, we can make them increasingly invisible, but the problem doesn't go away, and it's going to continue to come up until we can respond with a complex solution. And so that's that intersect between practice and policy. is we take practice issues and we try to come up with policy responses. And even if you say you're only going to do direct practice, I've never had a direct practice position where I wasn't involved with policy in some way. So it really, we kind of sometimes treat them as two different ends of a spectrum, but they're really intertwined. You're really doing both. I don't know if you had anything. Okay. So one of the things, so I mentioned this, we can go to the next slide. Back up one more. Okay. So one of the, we have foundational theories that we use in social work. And one of the several different ones that we use. But one of the key theories that we use is the ecological systems approach. And that's kind of a combination of two different theories, systems approach and then ecological approach. And basically what that means is that under the assumption that I mentioned before that social problems are quite complex, there's interplay that involves psychological, social, economic, political, physical forces. So what we do is when we are evaluating a client, we always evaluate them within the context of their broader environment. And that means that we need to be experts on those broader environments. Gender, how gender plays a role. If I have two clients side by side and they're both presenting with issues related to paranoia, maybe they don't like to walk by windows, maybe they're afraid of getting shot, I can't diagnose them without knowing their environment, right? If they tell me they live in a gate-guarded community where there hasn't been any shootings in the last 40 years, I'm going to go down a certain path with that. But if they tell me they live in a high-crime community where there have been multiple drive-by shootings, then that behavior becomes adaptive. And so that's just an example of how we really take a lot of time through the assessment process and evaluate all the different, what we might call ecosystems that the individual is dealing with related to gender, race, perhaps sexual orientation or gender expression, issues related to socioeconomic status, nationality, as many things as we can learn about the individual that will help their childhoods, housing insecurity, history of food insecurity, their educational background, and their history with the educational system. As many things as you can think of, we incorporate all of that into our assessment of them. And so then what we're doing is we're not pathologizing the individual. We're looking at the social environment. And again, that really emanates from the work of Jane Addams and then the social workers or social reformers that came after her, is saying that the problem isn't necessarily with the individual, but it's most likely with the environment, with society. But then what we do as social workers is we help that individual navigate their environment in a way that's more adaptive and healthier. And that can take on a lot of different forms.
Yeah, sorry. And a really good example is like, and that's another thing that Dr. Martin mentioned that really kind of separates social workers from like counseling, marriage and family therapists, and some of the other philosophy is that, again, I had for instance, a great example is when a kid comes to me with behavioral problems or issues, if a marriage and family therapist was seeing that same kid, same presenting problem, their focus is going to be on the family dynamics, what's going on with the parents, how come, are there boundaries set up or whatever. But as a social worker, I explore more of that. So as an example, like what Dr. Martin had mentioned, is that we look into, okay, do the kids, does that client have any friends at school? Is there stuff going on? Is he being bullied at school that's causing all this stuff? Is there stuff going on at home? There may be some issues that's going on at home. Or is the kid just having some other issues that we need to be aware of? And so again, you can see the perspective of, we have to be really mindful of looking at all these different potential plays that may affect this child the way he's acting out, not just looking at from one standpoint is that, okay, maybe the family dynamic needs to be more strengthened and have to set up more boundaries. And so that's a really good thing that we do as social workers, is again to kind of look at from all these different perspectives.
So here's just a couple of what we would call ecosystems that people operate in. Several of them, I mentioned them, but you know, whatever they're involved with and whatever has an influence on their life and how they're reacting to that, how they're responding. And then that transactional relationship is oftentimes what we focus on in counseling. I can't stop racism. I can't change the family law system. But what I can do is help clients learn how to engage in psychoeducation, also engage in using various modalities in counseling so that they can navigate their environments more effectively. And then this is an example of one of the, I think this is Bronfenbrenner's, conceptualizing this concept of ecological system so that the individual, each ring represents a different level of dynamics that impact them, from the personal ones, your neighborhood, your school, immediate family, your home life, etc. And then the mesosystem is broader than that. That's your school, work, neighborhood, home. Exosystem goes even broader than that, where we all know now how much we're influenced by mass media, right? A lot of evidence that it kind of determined our election. So we're all involved. And when you think about mass media 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, it meant something different than it means now, because now we've included social media in that. And I read something recently that adults are on social media about 9 hours a day and teens are on about 14 hours a day. Now, that doesn't mean they're not doing simultaneous things, but what it is we're going there for everything, for entertainment, for our news, oftentimes for a social connection. So we need to be able to look to see how that's impacting people. And then our macro system are basically our cultural beliefs, values. And for those people who are transmigrant, meaning that they come from one culture and then they're living in the United States, or African American, Mexican American, all indigenous populations that are operating within this macro system, it's very important to be able to look to see how are those, how are they handling, and how does society handle multicultural issues? Are they internalizing xenophobia? Or are they, if they're or nativism, how does that impact them in their daily lives? We've had a lot of those issues obviously come up recently. That as social workers, we need to be very aware of. That's why as social work, we don't have the luxury of being able to say, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just going to shut the news off and not listen to it for a month. That doesn't mean we need to be in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week feedback loop, but we need to be aware of what's going on in the world, because our clients don't have that luxury. It's impacting them on a daily basis for the most part, and we need to be able to deal with that. And then the transactional relationships, the assumption, the nature of the relationship between client and ecosystems is reciprocal. And that's what I mean by that transactional relationship, is you could have 3 people side by side, they're dealing with similar challenges, and each one of them will deal with it differently. How do they internalize it? We all have lenses that we use, we attach meaning to things. In fact, that's one modality is narrative therapy. And we each have a narrative in our head, and we play a role within that. So then what role are you playing? And a lot of times therapy can be really effective by helping someone change that role. Maybe they see themselves as a victim in every situation, and therefore they attach that meaning to any situation that they're in. And that's something that we can help them reframe. So the focus then, using a person and environment approach, we're looking at the person within the broader environment, the focus shifts the treatment from solely being the client's responsibility to it more of an interrelationship, right? So the goal, there are many goals with that, but one of them is it has kind of an automatic process of destigmatizing issues, because the individual sees themselves as part of a broader system. Ready? Okay. So it removes stigma. It avoids pathologizing clients. We have to use what's called the DSM because we are social workers, particularly in clinical settings, do have to diagnose clients, but we tend as a profession not to want to go in that direction. We understand that the environment shapes the person, and that even if they're responding in a way that we would perceive as maladaptive, sometimes it's the very things that we want to change in a counseling setting that kept the person alive when they were younger. the ability to dissociate in highly abusive situations and keep a child intact. But then as they get older and they're trying to connect with people and raise children and have long-term relationships, the attachment issues become a problem. And so we recognize that all behaviors at some point or another have an adaptive aspect to them, but at some point they become no longer adaptive, and we're focused on trying to shift them without pathologizing them. So in that sense, we use a strengths-based approach. When we're evaluating clients or we're looking at the client systems, we're always trying to approach it from a strengths perspective. Maybe the child who, I don't know, you might have some examples of kids that they just are absolutely insistent on misbehaving in class, but what's the positive there?
So just out of curiosity, what do you guys think strength-based is? What does that mean to you guys when we say strength-based?
For me, it's like, instead of focusing on what's wrong, with the child, like for instance, you said if they're misbehaving, instead of focusing on that misbehavior, you're focusing on what the child's doing well. Like you would look at other areas of the child's life that are besides the behavioral component.
Right. So a good example is again, if you had a child that's coming in who shows, symptoms or behaviors that's similar to ADD, right? So they're just bouncing all over the place, right? They can't stay focused. What do you think some of the strengths are for that child, for example?
Well, I think that the child can be very creative.
Right. Yeah. Right. And maybe that child is really smart and they just really bored out of their mind. That's why they can't stay focused, because this material is just, quite frankly, too boring for them. Right. So you want to look beyond a lot of that stuff.
And they have a lot of energy. Sometimes wears adults out, but in other environments, it's a really cool thing.
Right. So yeah, we turn that around, right? So yeah, the kid's running around, bouncing around. Yeah, he has a lot of good energy, So that's a way of reframing it so that we look at it from a strength base. And one of the biggest reasons why we do strength based is because once we start labeling it to somebody, then that label pretty much stays with them. Like Dr. Martin said, we rely on the DSM-5 right now for our diagnosis. But one of the things that I do, when I was practicing, is that I don't really tell my clients what their diagnosis is, because I'm not treating the diagnosis, I'm treating my client. And that's the biggest thing that we try to teach in grad school, is that we want them to focus on the client, not on these little stuff, so that they can kind of have their, because once you say I'm working with someone who has ADD, there's so many different interventions out there. And if you just stay focused, this is my little go-to intervention, again, with this whole system that we're looking at, not one clinical intervention is going to help every single one of those kids who have ADD. That's why we have multiple interventions, right? Other questions about strength-based?
One of the things I was thinking about with the kid who's persistently misbehaving is that shows resilience, right? It's directed in maybe a way that isn't convenient for adults, but it still shows resilience, that this kid has made a decision and they're sticking with it. So if you can shift their focus to something else that's more positive, you can take that, you can start by saying, I have a lot of respect and admiration for how persistent you are in the way that you behave. And you can shift that then to something positive. But if you start by pathologizing them that you're wrong and this is bad, you take a shame-based approach, basically, rather than a strengths-based approach. It's a funny dynamic. People tend to dig their heels in and they withdraw from you. One of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about the history of our career, but I just wanted to say one of the things that I like so much about this career is I went through undergraduate believing that I wanted to be a psychologist. And I ended up in social work kind of by default because those were the positions that were available. But I always just couldn't wait to get back into psychology. And obviously there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the two careers, but the settings are different. After years of being in social work and being in a practice-based setting where I was out doing home visits and seeing clients dealing with a range of very challenging social problems and issues, I finally decided to do a private practice, and I joined a practice of psychologists who were wonderful colleagues, but I didn't like it. I did it for about 4 or 5 years, but I never expected to miss being in court with clients or taking visiting them in their home or holding their hand as they were dying, or all the other facilitating support groups of survivors of homicide, all the different things, welcoming refugees to the country with a sign that said, "Welcome to America," getting them acclimated to the country. What I found was that I could empower clients and I could do a lot of good work when they came to my office for 50 minutes a week. But I found that I had a much more power in terms of my ability to affect clients. And it was a much more natural relationship if we're sitting on a courtroom bench and they open up to me, or if we're sitting on a bench outside because they don't have a home and I'm going to them rather than them coming to me. It was for me and my personality, I needed that. I needed the more dynamic environment, and I needed to be anchored in feeling like I was making a difference both on a direct level as well as a macro level. Let's go into now. Okay, so I want to talk a couple minutes just about the history of our profession, kind of the different way that people were evaluated. I mentioned briefly Jane Addams. It's about the same time, late 1800s, early 1900s, we had the parallel systems in place for caring for people who needed help. At that time, we might call them the unfortunate or the disenfranchised populations. There was the charity organization societies, or the COSs, and they tended to be a more conservative, used a more conservative approach. They did a lot of good, but they based their philosophy more on stigma, this perception that people had problems in their life because of things that they were doing wrong. So women were poor because they were promiscuous. Men were poor because they drank alcohol. And there wasn't, again, it was during a time period where social Darwinism was very popular in terms of an ideological belief system that people who had challenges in life, even if they were born into it, somehow they were doing something to promote that. So the good part of the COSs is that they acted in a way like the not United Nations, what is the broad umbrella organization that does a lot of funding. I'll remember it right after. No, they operated basically, I'm drawing a blank, as an overarching umbrella organization that organized caregiving. So the leaders of the COS organization believed that caregiving they were worried about fraud and rooting out fraud, people who were going to numerous agencies and getting cash and not using it for the right purposes. But United Way. So they acted like a United Way, where they organized caregiving. They didn't actually provide much direct care, but what they did do is they pretty much started the concept of case management, where they hired primarily women that would go out and work with people who needed help, and they would do like an assessment, and then they would determine what assistance they needed. It was quite paternalistic, though, because they would also ask neighbors of the people who were getting help to watch them, particularly if they were women, make sure men weren't coming over in the middle of the night, et cetera. And so there was a strong religious focus. So it was very, very influenced by the Christian religion and higher society. So a lot of women volunteered for these positions. The positive, what we got from that was again, this concept of organizing caregiving. So it was a little bit easier for someone to need to determine where they could get assistance. And then the concept of case management, where we would actually go into someone's home, talk to them, find out what was going on, and then come up with some sort of a plan or a case plan. Jane Addams, though, operated at the same time, and she had a very different perspective. I mentioned before, she believed that the problem lay primarily with society. She looked at social injustice, particularly against African-American and migrant populations. She was very concerned about exploitation, very, very concerned about believing that people were being encouraged to come to this country with promises of a better life, and then they were on indentured service contracts, placed in factories, in big, urban city centers, and they were exploited until basically they died very early a lot of times. And then their children were left, and then they either lived on the streets or were placed in orphanages or used as child labor. It was very, very common. So she started, what we got from her was this focus on social justice as being the core issue that our clients are dealing with. But also she gave, and this is another difference between other helping professions, our boundaries, our ethical values are different in that we believe in going to the client for the most part. That doesn't mean clients don't come in to see us, but when she opened the settlement house movement, the settlement house workers lived there alongside the clients. And that's something you typically wouldn't see with helping professions that are based on a medical model. Client comes to you for a certain amount of time, you diagnose them, you cure them, and they go back home to conceivably live better lives. So her focus was, again, social justice. She was a social reformer. She did a lot of policy work. She even did international work. She did direct practice as well as micro work. And her entire focus was, she was one of the pioneers on child labor laws. They were initially passed and they were overturned, and they didn't pass permanently until I think just right after she died. She wrote a lot about her work with children, and one of the most, and I'll end here and then transition to our case studies, but one of the most powerful things that she wrote about in one of her books was how she would have the children from the factories come to the settlement house movement on holidays in particular for reading hours and different things, but this was a holiday party. And she served them candy, which was a huge treat, particularly for the poor. And none of the girls, they're primarily girls, none of them ate any of it. And when she asked them why, they were working at the chocolate factory and they had to smell it all day long. There was very poor ventilation and it made them sick, so they never wanted to touch candy. I went to Jane Addams School of Social Work in Chicago, University of Illinois. And what was interesting is that chocolate factory is still there. And certain times of the day you can smell chocolate. It's not the same as obviously working there, to the point, for 12 hours a day and not being able to go to school, etc. The settlement house workers were also the first school social workers. When mandatory or compulsory education laws were passed in the early 1900s, it was the settlement house workers that made sure to get immigrant kids into the schools. And so when you think about all the social justice issues that have occurred in our history, social work tends to be at the table at almost all of it. And now one of the newer areas that we're going into is what's called green social work, environmental injustice, and then global social work, which isn't new, but that's something that we're increasingly focusing on. So,
any questions so far? Comments? So everybody, I think this was sent to you guys all, the little article. And so one of the things that I want to kind of refer you guys to is the case number 2 regarding Rick. So if you guys have that, if you guys don't,
Did they take that copy?
Yeah.
They should have read it. They were electronically sent it.
No worries.
Yeah.
So if you guys haven't got a chance to read it, maybe we can take a couple minutes to kind of read this. And as if you're reading it, maybe you can kind of look at, as Dr. Martin has mentioned earlier, about strength-based. And kind of as you're reading this particular case, look to see what are some of the strengths in this particular case. And then we can have a moment to kind of talk about that. And so maybe we can spend about, 4 or 5 minutes reviewing that case so that just you have some familiarity and we can kind of go from there. Yeah, there's a picture of his face. No. Oh, God.
It was okay if I posted that on our social media page.
Appreciate you said no.
He said he's probably all tatted up. Oh my God. They're just reading a case study, right?
Okay, so yeah, these two things. So how about a couple more minutes, and then we'll talk about, we'll have some discussions.
We can do that.
I'm not a big fan. I can appreciate Jerry.
I had to get acclimated to it all over again because my son went through the same phase. Where they're talking in front of somebody. And we was sort of like yawning and putting their hand.
Oh yeah, the lady, the girlfriend, it was like one of the girls.
So anyway.
Okay, so let's talk about this really quick. So one of the classes that I teach is the fields class, and the fields class is a very unique thing to grad school in social work, which is because it's directly related to or connected to the internship. Because in the Masters of Social Work program, one of the big requirements is that you have to have an internship for both years, and so the fields class is designed to kind of help transition students and build that bridge between the academic world and what they're experiencing in their clinical work. Thank you. And so the class is really laid out in a way to really, and it's a smaller class than most of the other classes because, again, it's designed to really provide this support system for you guys as students to really help you guys become more attuned to what's going on and gain some insights, and then also to be vulnerable so that you can kind of process some of the stuff out. And it's not really therapy because we don't ever do group therapy in class, but we do touch on a lot of areas. And so one of the examples that I want to kind of share with you guys, and that's why we gave you guys this case study, was that just so that you have some information about Rick, and so you can kind of understand what that class might look like if you were in our class. And so as you're reading this, what were some of the strengths that you saw with Rick's case? Were you able to identify any of the strengths within this particular case?
He was very resilient.
Okay.
reading that he said he wouldn't fall in a situation with his family.
Uh-huh.
His dad was abusive. He didn't want to do the same thing. Repeat that same
Right.
pattern with his own family.
Right. So he had a little insight to, hey, this is a pattern, and if I don't get out of this, then I will be in the same situation with my kids, right? Okay. Anything else? Any other strength that you guys notice? Okay. So what are some of the various ecosystems? You know, Dr. Martin had mentioned about what are some of the, you know, and again, we're strength-based, but we also look at the society and how it may have impacted his behavior. And so as you're reading this, what do you think are some of the various ecosystems? It's hard.
Think gender, think childhood issues, legal system.
And you can think outside the box, right? I think part of this is, again, helping you guys understand, you know, within grad school is one of our biggest focuses for you guys to think outside the box. It's not, you know, it's linear in one way, but there's many ways to approaching things, right? Maybe perhaps at an early age, dad let him play Grand Theft Auto, you know, on the video games, where he's exposed to a lot of video games that has a lot of violence. Or dad plays a lot of violent video games. You know, I had a case where dad was into gaming more than the kid was, but then a lot of the games were not very appropriate, but he was letting the kid view the games as he's playing it, right? And a lot of that has some impact on that, right? What are some of the transactional relationships with his ecosystems and healthy, or are they creating barriers to optimal functioning? So what do you, so with that particular thing, what do you think are some of the I guess, how should I phrase it? Yeah, what are some of the barriers that's preventing him from being successful?
I guess not having like a support system.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, I like that.
If he would have had somebody to talk to, maybe he would not continue that cycle even later on in his marriage with his wife.
Right. So as a social worker, what are some things that you would need to do to kind of help that once you had identify the barriers?
I think I've got to some system.
Right.
Even like group counseling or
Right.
support.
Yeah, maybe, you know, if you were a school social worker, you would maybe connect him with like a lunch bunch or a support group system for him, right? What about for the parents or the family members?
Like,
What kind of support would you provide for them?
well, it seemed like they had like a lot of alcohol abuse too, so maybe like going to
AA?
Yeah, AA, and maybe like it's helpful for them to go to the meetings as well. Maybe
Right.
they're not the alcoholic, but at least they can put themselves in the shoes.
And there is a 12-step program that's for folks who Al-Anon.
And
Right.
team.
So then they can kind of go and kind of see how that all plays out. So again, creating and helping providing resources and referrals to support groups so that they can understand that.
What about the role of trauma? Because he was raised in an abusive environment, so hasn't dealt with his trauma yet.
Yeah, he never addressed it, so
Right.
like he didn't really know any better, so he just thought saying it out loud would probably help him, but he never actually he wasn't cared for as a child. He was the one caring for his mother, and he was a protector, but no one ever protected him.
Exactly. So we have modeling issue of where he's modeling his coping mechanisms after unhealthy people, including his father. So he may have some elements. Sounds like he's got a lot of elements related to his father, patterns. Even though he doesn't want to address, he's still following in those footsteps because of modeling. And then also as a victim, he's experienced trauma. And so both of those things coming together might make treatment, he might be resistant to treatment because he might not be able to traverse this idea that he's a victim to seeing himself as a perpetrator, which can be a barrier to treatment.
And so again, part of my class is there's this parallel, right? So we talk about and identify clients that students are having issues with at their internships or questions or how to maneuver around that. And so we identify all this stuff like what we're doing here. But then there's also this other parallel process about how is it affecting you guys as students? You know, because again, as Dr. Martin has mentioned, you know, or we didn't mention this, but you know, you got secondary trauma that could be exposure to having all this stuff, right? Most of the folks who are not in social work, they turn on the news, they see some trauma stuff going on, they turn it off, and that's it. Mm-hmm. So 30 minutes in a day, they see this stuff, and then they move on to something else. But for you guys as potential students, you know, you're going to be exposed to this 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so there's a huge play to that. And so one of the things that we try to do in class is really kind of focus on how is this all affecting you and where or not, and helping you guys gain some insight to this. You know, maybe there are some parallels about how Rick's life may be mirrored to that of your cousin's life or whatever. And how does that affect you guys, right? And so that's something that we try to do in class, is really help bridge that and kind of raise that awareness up. Again, we don't do therapy, but then if something does come up, then we will refer you to the appropriate resources, right? Obviously here on campus, what are some of the resources that we can provide for you guys as students? CAP, right? That's probably one of the biggest ones that we go to. And there's days that literally we have instructors that will walk the students straight over to CAPS and support them and be there for them and make sure that they get the referral set up, and then, you know, we'll move on, right? And so part of this class is for you guys to understand that component of it, because it's really important, right? Because one of the things that when you guys go into this field, potentially, or other fields, is to be mindful of how well you're taking care of yourself, because that's one of the biggest things. And that's something that I'm really proud of with our program, is that, you know, for the last 2 years, the emphasis is now focused is on self-care, right? Because whether you're going into social work or public health, or like the other student who started to do ABA, you know, one of the biggest things is longevity within the field. And I think that's something that I really try to push for you guys to understand, is that you can be really good at what you do, you know, whether it's speech language, you know, social work or whatever. This all has a draining effect on you guys. And if you guys can't figure out how to take care of yourself, you won't last in this field, right? We know that. You know, my wife is a speech language pathologist working in the school system. It is uberly hard. If anyone ever worked in, you know, kids who have ABA or who have autistic needs, it is very draining. And same thing with social work. And so just being mindful of that is really important. So that's the last piece of our classes that we try to touch upon, is the self-care piece, right? Any questions, comments? And, you know, and before we kind of come off with, what did you guys get out of this? Because obviously for us, it's also about getting feedback so that we can kind of help you guys as well.
One question. Have you ever had a case where your student has been in the field and has had what is that word, like trauma from the experience of their client and themselves? Do they just still stick with the case, or has it ever been like, oh, it's too much for them?
That's a really good question. I can only speak from personal experience, which is when I went to school, the cases were never this difficult that my students are subjected to. Even with that said, it's all also individualized too, because certain students handle things a little better, other students may not. And so we try to work with that. You know, one of the things that we do is that we have whoever's teaching that field class also is considered the field liaison to their internship. So we'll have meetings with their field instructor out in the field and try to work on ways to kind of help support that student so that that student can continue to be successful, right? But there's times where we have students where they're like, okay, this is too close to home. I can't. This is exactly what happened to me when I was growing up and all this stuff. Then, you know, we'll talk about options with them, you know, whether it's CAPS or maybe taking a leave of absence for a year so that they can kind of regroup, go out, seek out therapy, and then come back and be healthy.
I think it's really important too to realize that the majority of people that go into social work do so because of experiences they've had in their lives or experiences that someone close to them has had.
Right.
And that's good because that adds to our sense of passion and our empathy for our clients. Sometimes it can create challenges, and they're challenges that we expect, that we over empathize with a client. We forget that it's their journey, and we start thinking that it's our journey. And all of those frameworks that students learn in school, such as you never work harder than your client, or you always see yourself as a part of a team, and it's their journey, not your journey. Those things can sometimes fall into the background as maybe they get too triggered. And so that, in a certain situation, or overwhelmed, or the boundaries start merging, that's what clinical supervision is for, because we all experience those things. I had difficulty when my son was really little working with some of the cases that I had that involved child abuse. It started impacting. I started having more fear. It was more like vicarious victimization that I was experiencing. I was at a point in my career, though, where I could make the choice to say, I'm going to shift careers. This is just too much for me right now. I don't want to have to deal with this. But if I was in school and that was my placement, I would have had to figure out a way to deal with it, but with support. So it's not as if I'm not a good social worker that I'm being true. We're human beings. I mean, we're not the type of people that can leave a job at the office, right? Hopefully we're not crying harder than our clients. But when I was doing hospice, I mean, I would have been a robot if at times I hadn't teared up. So that's not what this is about. But what this is about is that we're always the healthiest person in the room when we're with clients, and that the focus is on the client. So even if we're engaging in a little bit of self-disclosure, it's solely because what's best for the client. It's not because we can relate to them so much we choose to commiserate. So this whole idea of maybe taking a leave or getting counseling or whatever, that's a part of professional growth. We don't see that as, now you can't be a social worker. We see that as part of training professionals to engage in self-care. And a big part of that is recognizing who you are as an individual, what your triggers are, when you're getting close to your triggers, and then knowing how to seek help. So most of the social workers I know see counseling as one of the most positive ways that you can engage in self-care. They don't see it stigmatized.
Yeah, from a strength-based perspective, it shows that we have insights to our own emotions, our own feelings, and therefore we're seeking out services for our own self. And then the other piece too is, like Dr. Martin mentioned, is like that self-disclosure. We can also use that in therapy and kind of let them know that it's healthy and kind of like a role model. It's like, yeah, I sought out therapy too. Oh, you did? Well, cool. And so then that way you can build that connection and that rapport in helping, and then refocusing back onto the client. Right? Yes.
I have a question. So in your field, you guys hear a lot, you see a lot. How do you not internalize that, and how do you kind of like let go at the end of the day? What strategies do you have? Because I know it's heavy work.
I'll be honest with you. When I first started, and I tell my students, I'm very open about it, I used to drink like there was no tomorrow.
Really?
Yeah, obviously it was not the healthiest thing. I was in Portland, Oregon, and there's so many cool microbrews up there, and so
Morgan.
beer was just like flowing everywhere. Like it was like you come into work, you go out for lunch, you invite the supervisor, so that the supervisor orders the beer, and you follow suit, and then you work on happy hour. And I thought about that, and it was like for 6-7 months, just straight on. And then one day I just came to work, and and I knew it was bad, because as soon as I got to work, we skipped lunch and we went right to, okay, where are we going for happy hour? When are we doing this? How soon can we get out of work so we can go to happy hour? And so I realized I was not in a good place to be for myself, but then more importantly, for the kids I'm supposed to be protecting. And so for me, I transitioned to like working out. That became my religion. Like literally everything was based around that. Obviously being single at the time, I could afford to have a lot of time on my hand and not a lot of responsibility. So I was in the gym pretty much from 7:30 p.m. to like 11 p.m. And so that was Monday through Sunday. Like everything had to be around that, and so that was my way of working out. But then I started doing art, I started doing other things. And so it became, and everyone has their own thing, right? And so for me, it was going back to, it's about being mindful of some of the negative stuff that I was doing, and so I switched from working out and then to eating, and I realized I didn't know how to cook, and so I had to learn how to cook, and so that became part of my passion.
I think for me, it was a couple different things. One, when I first entered the field as just after my undergraduate work, I had no boundaries. I was working with kids. I was, so fed by rescuing them that I got burned out after about 4 years, and I thought, I'm leaving the field. I can't do this anymore. I ultimately ended up, and I did leave for about a year, but I ended up back in the field, and I thought, this time I'm going to do it differently. Because just what Professor Tran was saying, it doesn't do us any good if we end up having all the passion in the world, but we drop out after a few years. And so after that, I made sure to utilize all the resources that were available to me, recognizing that I'm a part of a team, that I'm not making decisions completely on my own, that I'm not getting too fed by my clients needing me, so that I recognize what I'm bringing to the table in these, because it's a relationship at the end of the day. And then I did a lot of reading in terms of what are some of the models for self-care and what does that actually look like? Because that's one of those easier said than done things, especially if you don't have a lot of time. But a part of self-care is creating mental paradigms. And I mentioned a few of them before, this notion of not working harder than your client. As soon as you start feeling burned out with a client, take a step back and go, wait a minute, am I taking more responsibility for their journey than they are? One of the things that I ascribe to in every area of my life is this notion that the universe will always find balance. If I overfunction, someone else is going to underfunction. Right? So if I jump in and I'm doing 80%, that doesn't mean that everything's 50-50. That doesn't mean that in the beginning of a relationship, I'm not doing a little bit more work with an under-functioning client. But that shouldn't be the goal, to stay there. And so if I have that paradigm and I can be flexible with it, then I know that if I'm over-functioning, it's not in their best interest. And then also this notion of, even if I'm not working on a team that's present right there with me at all times, I sometimes envision a longitudinal team. I'm going to come into their life for a certain period of time, for a season, and then I leave. And then I have to trust that someone else is going to come in, just like people have come into my life. So I envision myself always as being part of a big multidisciplinary team, even if I never meet the other people. And then just as what Professor Tran said as well, it's important to have things in your life that don't have the connection. I'm not a leave everything at the office person. I may think about something. I do work in the evenings,
Yeah, you're lying if you leave it.
Yeah, there's no such thing as.
There's no way.
Depending upon the setting that you're in too, you might be on call. There's all sorts of things. But we're certainly dealing with emotional issues here. But I think, like anything else in your life, to be able to have healthy boundaries, to make sure that you're saying no. If my default used to be yes to everything, and now I try to make it no. And then I can always change my mind. But if you think of your time and your energy as almost like a bank account, you might want to spend all your money, but you have to have a margin there. And so I think of my time as that way too. And then for me, I don't like working out. I would never go to a gym, but I'm a yoga person. So I try to make sure to have, and I haven't done a very good job in the last few weeks, but I try to make time for some mindfulness and meditation and yoga, and then art as well. And just, make sure I'm always experiencing joy. I became like I'm greedy with joy now. So if I'm going through a real stressful time, I'm not in practice any longer, but we have students, we have all sorts of other requirements, and I'm teaching this material, which can be quite emotional at times, that I'm making sure I'm experiencing joy every day in some way, and being very purposeful and proactive about getting out in nature and different things like that.
And the one thing that I would also add is get that support system. Oh, yeah. And that support system shouldn't be your spouse or your partner sometimes, especially because if they're not in the field, you're going to traumatize them as much as you're going to traumatize yourself, right? And so I found very quickly early on, I had two sets of friends, my work friends, where I can talk dungeon, talk about the darkest things. And then even to this day, a lot of times, 90% of the time, my wife has no idea what it is that I do and what I experience, because I don't want to re-traumatize her. I tried that initially, where how was your day, honey? Oh yeah, well, I had a kid that came in there and he was sexually abused. Stop, and then she's like, okay, I don't want to hear all that, because it's just too much. For me, it's like, hey, this is another day. It's part of my 8 hours. But again, I learned very quickly early on that if you're not in this field, you're gonna traumatize them more than you want to.
And different people have different aptitudes. If someone talks to me about math, I feel incredibly overwhelmed.
Right.
Someone talks to me about anything related to human dynamics, I find myself leaning in and I want to hear more about it.
Right.
And so also make sure, the last thing I'll say, because I know we need to wrap up, is make sure your support system is positive. Because sometimes social workers, we, just like police officers or other first responders, we can get into this negative thing and we don't ever end up moving toward a positive resolution to situations. So make sure you've got positive people in that support group as well.
That's probably the biggest thing, is surround yourself with positive people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me just
You guys
not live.
your answer.